Her trip started from a rainbow in the sky and wrapped up on a sunny Sunday in Beijing. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen seemed to have had a fruitful trip. She said she lost no time meeting extensively with senior members of China's new economic team, 10 hours in 2 days.
My objective during this trip has been to establish and deepen relationships with the new economic leadership team in place in Beijing. Our discussions are part of a broader, concerted effort to stabilize the relationship, reduce the risk of misunderstanding, and discuss areas of cooperation. Over the past 2 days, I have had the chance to do just that. These conversations were direct, substantive, and productive.
And she repeated clearly, almost at every meeting, that decoupling between China and the U.S. is a bad idea.
Indeed, I noted that China's growth has lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty and made clear that the United States is not seeking to decouple from China. We know that a decoupling of the world's two largest economies would be disastrous for both countries and destabilizing for the world.
At the media briefing room on Sunday, I did notice the U.S. Treasury Secretary not only steered away from rhetorical words like decoupling, conflict, fragmentation, but also focused on specific concerns given the sober realities of China-U.S. relations. On the economy and trade, she said businesses should be assured of a wide space to engage in economic interactions that are free from controversy to both sides. On the complaints that national security concerns have been blown out of proportion, adding fuel to the fire of tensions in relations, Yellen minced no words with these principles: transparent, narrowly scoped, and not used to gain economic advantage. On global issues such as the climate crisis and managing sovereign debt sustainably, Yellen said it is in the interest of the whole world that China and the U.S. exercise responsible global leadership. When she said these, one could tell the media corps in the briefing room breathed a sigh of relief. In fact, I managed to briefly talk to a number of reporters from China, different parts of Asia, Europe, and of course the U.S. Many said that they would be quite interested in knowing how the two sides, through Yellen's visit, would come up with measures to put a floor to the deepening rift between China and the United States. To me, a Chinese journalist who has been keenly following developments over the past months, I totally agree with them, if you ask me. Through the media briefing and various readouts of Secretary Yellen during her China trip, I noticed an underlining feature between her words and the principles advocated by the Chinese side for months. For example, in his recent meetings with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Bill Gates from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Chinese President Xi Jinping consistently emphasized the need for direct communication and the importance of both sides responsibly managing their relations for the sake of the two countries and the world.
People should interact and communicate more to increase mutual understanding. The world needs a generally stable China-U.S. relationship. Whether the two countries can find the right way to get along bears on the future and destiny of humanity.
But expressing common ground in words is just and only the very first step. China has asked clearly recently about what concrete actions can be taken by the U.S. side to carry out the important consensus reached by the two presidents in the G20 summit last November. Senior U.S. administration officials' visit to China is certainly a good start. Secretary Yellen's visit to China followed that of Secretary Blinken's in June, and according to media reports, is likely to be followed by that of John Kerry, the U.S. president's climate envoy. These are just the first step, but what is more important is how and when to establish more reliable and stable channels for high-quality, constant communications between the two sides. I raised my hands Several times, in fact, during Secretary Yellen's media conference on Sunday, I tried several times to ask that question and shouted out eventually at the end of the briefing as she wrapped up the half-an-hour interaction with journalists.
How to address national security concerns.
Talk about the specific channel of communication. What kind of specific channel of communication, please? When she heard my question, she slightly turned her head to me, apparently listening carefully, and slightly smiled, but she did not give a specific answer. Words turned into concrete actions are not just limited to official communication channels, but also concrete policies coming out of Washington. One of them is the long-time controversial tool attempted by the U.S. side to restrict certain U.S. investments in China in the so-called specific sensitive technologies with significant national security implications. That policy is not only opposed by the Chinese business community, but also many from the U.S. business community and even some U.S. Congress members. The U.S. Treasury Secretary fell short of a definite answer about how to make sure policies like these would never be pushed to harm either businesses or economic ties. Not to mention the level of trust between China and the U.S. is at its historic low level since the two sides had diplomatic relations in the 1970s. What will it take to make sure promises made by the U.S. side would endure the test of time? And these would be more than just empty words. Some earlier commitments made through visits by administration officials were not necessarily realized so far, and later harsh rhetorics risked the danger of casting long shadows and worsening relations. Well, no one is expecting one single trip to make miracles, but one should understand it takes great guts and strength in the days, weeks, and months ahead to stick to the principles and best practices agreed upon during these trips. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing, CGTN.